The German officer stood over the wreckage, pistol drawn, watching the American pilot crawl from the shattered fuselage. The pilot was bleeding. His aircraft was burning. He was surrounded by enemy soldiers on their own airfield deep inside occupied territory. There was no rescue coming, no escape. And yet, as they dragged him to his feet, the Americans started laughing. 41 seconds later, every German on that airfield stopped moving. What did he know that they didn't? The winter of 1944 pressed down on Western Europe like a wet wool blanket soaked in ice. Fog clung to river valleys. Sleet turned runways into treacherous ribbons of black glass. And somewhere beneath that gray ceiling, the air war continued without pause. By December, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had reached a fever pitch of desperation and determination. The 8th Air Force flew from bases scattered across eastern England, their contrails scratching white lines across skies that rarely cleared. Every morning, hundreds of heavy bombers lifted off before dawn, climbing through cloud layers that seemed to have no ceiling, aiming for targets deep inside the Reich. The mission tempo was relentless. Oil refineries, rail yards, aircraft, factories. The industrial heartland of Nazi Germany had become a target-rich environment, but reaching it meant flying through some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Flak batteries ringed every city of consequence. Luftwaffe fighters, though diminished, still rose to intercept with fanatic determination. And the weather itself became a weapon, hiding targets beneath impenetrable cloud cover, icing up wings and instruments, turning every mission into a calculated gamble against nature and enemy alike. For the fighter pilots escorting those bombers, the job had evolved. Early in the war, their role was purely defensive, staying close to the formation, driving off attackers. But by late 1944, doctrine had changed. Fighter command now encouraged aggressive action. Pilots were told to pursue enemy aircraft to the ground, if necessary, to strafe airfields, to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. This new philosophy was producing results, but it came with costs. Going low meant entering the domain of light flak, the rapid-fired 20mm and 37mm guns that could shred an aircraft in seconds. It meant exposing oneself to small arms fire from every direction. It meant that engine trouble or a single lucky shot could leave a pilot stranded in enemy territory with no hope of reaching friendly lines. The fighters making these attacks were predominantly Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and North American Pelimapusato Mustangs. Both aircraft had proven themselves in escort duty. Both were being pushed into the ground attack role with increasing frequency, and both were accumulating losses that the statistics would later reveal were almost as costly as those suffered by bomber crews. The airfields they attacked were scattered across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. Some were major installations with concrete runways and permanent facilities. Others were improvised strips carved out of farmland, hidden beneath camouflage netting, visible only when aircraft emerged from concealment. All of them were dangerous. On the morning in question, a cold front had stalled over the continent, dropping temperatures well below freezing and leaving a thin layer of frost on everything it touched. Pilots in their ready rooms stamped their feet and wrapped their hands around coffee cups that went cold within minutes. Ground crews worked with numb fingers, pre-flighting aircraft whose metal surfaces burned, exposed skin on contact. The mission briefing had been standard escort duty for a heavy bomber strike against industrial targets. Primary rendezvous over the Low Countries. Expected opposition moderate to heavy, weather uncertain. Return before dark, if possible. What happened next would unfold in a matter of hours, but its implications would echo through the remainder of a single pilot, a single aircraft, a single moment of apparent defeat that became something else entirely. If these stories of courage deserve to be remembered, like and subscribe. Robert Eugene Patterson had grown up in a world that seemed impossibly distant from the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Born in 1922 in rural Ohio, he came of age during the Depression when his family's small farm struggled to produce enough to survive. He learned early that problems didn't solve themselves, that complaining accomplished nothing. and that the only path forward was through. His childhood was defined by work. Before school, there were animals to feed. After school, there were fences to mend, equipment to repair, crops to tend. Summers meant 18-hour days in fields that stretched to the horizon. Winters meant the same work with frozen hands and shorter light. He never questioned it. It was simply life. What set Patterson apart was a quality his teachers noticed but couldn't quite name. He saw patterns others missed. When a tractor engine wouldn't start, he could diagnose the problem by listening to the way it turned over. When crops failed in one section of a field but thrived in another, he traced the difference to drainage patterns invisible to everyone else. His mind worked by observation, analysis, and deduction. Aviation entered his consciousness through the county fair where barnstorming pilots still performed in the late 1930s. He watched them loop and roll above the fairgrounds, saw the way that aircraft responded to inputs he couldn't see, and felt something shift inside him. The machines made sense to him. Their physics were logical. Their movements were predictable if you understood the forces at work. When the war came, Patterson was already working as a mechanic at a small airfield in Indiana, having traded farm work for engine work after his father's death. He knew aircraft from the ground up, understood their systems and limitations, had logged unofficial stick time with pilots who let him take the controls during repositioning flights. Enlisted in the Army Air Forces in early 1942, not out of patriotic fervor, but because it was the logical thing to do. His aptitude tests revealed what his instructors had suspected. Patterson absorbed information like dry soil absorbing rain. Flight training came easily to him, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he paid attention to details others ignored. He noticed how the aircraft behaved in different configurations, memorized the subtle sounds that indicated problems before they became emergencies, and developed an almost intuitive understanding of his machine. By the time he shipped overseas in the summer of 1944, Patterson had accumulated more flight hours than most pilots his age. He had also developed a reputation for something his squadron mates found both admirable and slightly unsettling: thought too much. While other pilots relied on instinct and aggression, Patterson approached combat like a chess player, always considering what came next, always looking for angles and options. He flew P-47 Thunderbolts with the 362nd Fighter Squadron, part of the 357th Fighter Group based at Lyon in Suffolk. The group had earned a distinguished record in escort operations, and by December 1944 had begun participating in the expanded ground attack missions that Fighter Command was pushing. Patterson had flown 37 missions by the time winter set in. He had shot down to enemy aircraft, confirmed and damaged several others. He had survived flak, weather, mechanical problems, and the accumulated exhaustion that every combat pilot carried. He had also begun noticing something that others seemed to overlook. The Germans were adapting. Their airfield defenses were changing. The positioning of flak guns, the dispersal patterns of aircraft on the ground, the timing of when fighters scrambled to intercept. All of it was evolving in response to American tactics. Patterson had started keeping notes, sketching diagrams of what he observed during strafing runs, trying to understand the logic behind enemy decisions. His commanding officer had noticed the notebooks, but said nothing. Pilots developed their own methods for coping with the stress of combat. If Patterson wanted to fill his spare time with maps and calculations, it was harmless enough. What the Rosa? What the commander didn't realize was that Patterson was building a model in his mind, a pattern that would become relevant sooner than anyone expected. The mission that changed everything began like any other. Cold morning, frost on the wings, routine briefing followed by the long walk to the flight line. Patterson climbed into his aircraft, ran through his pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, and waited for the signal to start engines. He had no way of knowing that within hours he would be on the ground, surrounded by enemies, watching everything he had observed suddenly make terrible perfect sense. The escort mission proceeded normally for the first 3 hours. Patterson's flight climbed to altitude, rendezvoused with the bomber stream over the channel, and took up their assigned position above and to the side of the formation. The cold at 25,000 feet was brutal, seeping through flight suits and gloves, numbing extremities, despite the aircraft's heating system. Below them, The heavy bombers droned eastward in their characteristic combat box formations. Hundreds of aircraft spreading across miles of sky. The contrails they left were visible for enormous distances. White fingers pointing toward the target, advertising their presence to every observer on the ground. Enemy fighters appeared sporadically, small formations of messes and foul wolves, probing the edges of the escort screen, looking for gaps, sometimes pressing attacks, and sometimes breaking away when the P-47s turned toward them. Patterson's flight chased off to such formations without engaging, the enemy aircraft diving for the deck before contact could be made. The problem revealed itself gradually as the mission progressed deeper into enemy territory. Patterson noticed increasing radio traffic from other fighter groups reporting ground targets, airfields, parked aircraft, opportunities. The new aggressive doctrine was taking hold with escorts breaking off to pursue targets of opportunity whenever bomber coverage hollowed. Patterson's flight leader made the decision after the bombers completed their primary attack and turned for home. A reconnaissance report had identified an active Luftwaffe field approximately 40 miles south of their current position. Intelligence suggested it housed a squadron of fighters that had been intercepting recent missions. The flight was ordered to investigate and attack if conditions permitted. They descended through broken cloud cover, the air warming as they dropped, the ground materializing beneath them as a patchwork of snow-dusted fields and bare winter forests. Navigation was challenging in the overcast, but the flight leader found his landmarks and corrected course until the airfield appeared ahead. It was a prepared grass strip, perhaps 1,500 meters long, bordered by dispersal areas hidden beneath netting and natural camouflage. Several aircraft were visible on the ground, some parked in revetments, others seemingly in the process of being serviced. Activity suggested the field was operational. The attack began well. The flight leader went in first, his guns tearing into a parked aircraft that erupted in flame. The second element followed, strafing a fuel truck that added a secondary explosion. To the chows. To the chows. Patterson was fourth in line, pulling his throttle back slightly to establish interval, watching the tracers from ground defenses begin to rise. That was when everything went wrong. The flak was heavier than anticipated. The Germans had positioned additional guns since the last reconnaissance, and they opened fire with a coordinated barrage that filled the air with explosions. Patterson felt his aircraft shudder as fragments struck somewhere behind him. Ah! Warning. Light illuminated on his instrument panel. Oil pressure was dropping. He had seconds to make a decision, continue the attack and risk complete engine, failure over the airfield, or break off and attempt to reach friendly lines with a wounded aircraft. The mathematics were simple. He was too far from safety. The engine was losing pressure too quickly. He would not make it. Patterson pulled up and away from the attack, gaining what altitude he could, looking for options that didn't exist. The engine began to run rough, then rougher, then ceased entirely with a grinding noise that he felt through the airframe. The propeller windmilled. Uselessly. Smoke began trailing from the cowling. He was going down. That much was certain. The only question was where. Below him, the airfield was in chaos. Fires burned. Personnel ran between buildings. Flak guns continued to fire at the other American aircraft, still pressing their attacks. It was, Patterson realized with a strange clarity, the worst possible place to crash land. And it was also the only place within gliding distance. He set up for an emergency approach, aiming for a relatively clear stretch of ground beyond the main runway. The controls were sluggish without engine power, and the aircraft was bleeding altitude faster than he'd hoped. Trees rushed toward him, then a fence. Then the earth itself coming up hard and fast. The impact was violent. The landing gear, still retracted, struck first, and the aircraft slid across frozen ground on its belly, throwing up dirt and debris, shedding pieces of itself. As it went, Patterson was thrown forward against his harness, then sideways, then forward again as the aircraft spun and finally stopped. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. But he was also surrounded by enemies on their airfield, with no weapon beyond his sidearm and no possibility of escape. German soldiers were already running toward him. The first Germans reached the wreckage within 90 seconds. Patterson could see them through the shattered canopy. Young men in Luftwaffe, ground crew uniforms, some carrying rifles, all of them shouting, in a language he couldn't understand. He raised his hands slowly, the universal gesture of surrender, and waited for what came next. They pulled him from the cockpit with more force than was necessary, dragging him across the wing root and dropping him onto the frozen ground. His legs buckled. Something was wrong with his left ankle. A sharp pain that suggested a sprain or fracture from the impact. He couldn't run, even if he'd had somewhere to go. An officer arrived, pistol drawn, barking orders that sent the enlisted men scattering. He stood over Patterson with an expression that combined contempt, curiosity, and professional assessment. The American was bleeding from a cut above his eye. His flight suit was torn. He was clearly no longer a threat. What happened next would be recounted differently by the few German survivors who later spoke of it. Some said the American appeared calm. Others said he was in shock. What they agreed upon was that Patterson had looked around the airfield with an intensity that seemed out of place for a man who had just crashed and been captured. He was, in fact, observing everything. The smoke rising from two burning aircraft. The positions of the flak guns that were still tracking aircraft in the distance. The dispersal patterns of the remaining parked fighters. The fuel storage area partially visible beyond a line of trees. The ammunition depot, marked by earth berms and warning signs. And something else. Something the Germans had apparently not noticed. During his approach, while fighting to control his dying aircraft, Patterson had seen the rest of his flight break off their attack and climb away. But he had also seen one. Of them, he couldn't tell which pilot, begin a wide circling pattern at altitude. Standard doctrine for a downed airman was to mark the location and report it for potential rescue. The circling aircraft suggested someone was doing exactly that. What Patterson knew, and what the Germans apparently didn't realize, was that the circling aircraft had a radio, and that radio could reach other American fighters in the area. An American fighter doctrine in December 1944 was explicitly aggressive about attacking enemy airfields. His surviving squadron mates would not abandon him. They would come back. They would come back with hell. And when they did, they would attack this airfield with everything they had. Patterson looked at the chaos around him, at the fire still burning, at the ground crews running to save what remained of their aircraft, at the flak guns that were now pointing uselessly at empty sky. He looked at the officer standing over him, still holding his pistol, still radiating authority and control. And he laughed. It was not a performance. It was not bravado. It was the simple release of a man who understood something that his captors did not. He was a prisoner. He might be shot. He might be tortured. But in approximately 40 seconds, based on the time it would take for the circling aircraft to vector in reinforcements, and for those reinforcements to arrive at attack speed, this airfield was going to experience the full weight of American air. Power. The German officer's expression changed. The contempt faded. Something like uncertainty replaced it. He looked around, following the American's gaze, trying to see what the pilot was seeing. Then the sound reached them. Engines. Multiple engines coming in fast and low from the northwest. The officer's head snapped toward the sound. His pistol arm dropped. For a moment he seemed paralyzed by indecision, caught between the prisoner at his feet and the threat materializing in the sky. Patterson stopped laughing. He pressed himself flat against the ground, covering his head with his arms, making himself as small as possible. The first Thunderbolts came in at treetop height, their 850 caliber guns already firing. The attack unfolded with a precision that Patterson could follow, even from his position on the ground. He had watched enough strafing runs to recognize the pattern. Lead element coming from the northwest, catching the flak positions while they were still oriented toward the retreating aircraft. Second element splitting to cover the dispersal areas. Third element targeting the facilities. The sound was overwhelming. The roar of radial engines at full power, the hammering of heavy machine guns, the screaming of metal being torn apart, the concussive thump of fuel and ammunition cooking off. It filled his ears and his chest and his skull, making thought impossible, reducing existence to pure sensory overload. He kept his face pressed against the frozen dirt, hands over his head, body curled into a protective ball. Tracers snapped overhead. Debris rained down around him. The heat from burning aircraft washed over his exposed skin in waves. He could smell fuel and cordite and something else, the particular odor of hot metal and burning oil that he associated with mechanical death. The German officer who had been standing over him was gone. Whether he had run, taken cover, or been hit, Patterson couldn't tell. The soldiers who had pulled him from the cockpit had scattered in every direction. For these 41 seconds, he was alone on a battlefield that had become something approaching hell. The timing was not coincidence. Patterson would later learn that his circling wingman had indeed radioed for assistance, reaching to other flights that were returning from escort duty with full ammunition loads. They had arrived over the airfield just as the original attack flight completed its orbit, giving them a combined force of 12 Thunderbolts against a field whose defenses had already been degraded. The coordination was imperfect, as combat coordination always was. Aircraft came in at intervals rather than simultaneously. Some targets were hit multiple times, while others escaped attention entirely. The fog of war was as thick here as anywhere else, with pilots making split-second decisions based on incomplete information and obscured sight pictures. But the cumulative effect was devastating. Patterson risked lifting his head during a momentary pause in the firing. What he saw was an airfield, transformed. The neat rows of dispersal revetments were now scattered with burning wreckage. The fuel storage area was a pillar of black smoke, climbing hundreds of feet into the gray sky. At least 2 flak positions had been silenced, their guns pointing at odd angles, their crews either dead or fled. He saw one Thunderbolt pull up from its strafing run, trailing smoke from its engine, cowling, hit by ground fire that had found its mark. The pilot was climbing, trying to gain altitude before the engine failed, following the same calculus Patterson had attempted minutes earlier. This time the aircraft cleared the field boundary before it began to descend. The pilot might make it 2 friendly lines. He might not. Patterson would not know for certain until much later. The attack lasted perhaps 3 minutes from first shot to last aircraft departing. In combat time, it was an eternity. In real time, it was barely longer than a popular song. When the sound of engines finally faded and the smoke began to drift across the field in the light wind, Patterson found himself in a landscape utterly changed from the one where he had crashed. German personnel were emerging from cover, some of them wounded, many of them clearly in shock. The systematic organization that had characterized their response to his crash had dissolved into chaos. Men wandered between burning wrecks, looking for wounded comrades, trying to salvage equipment, simply standing and staring at the destruction. Patterson remained where he was. He was still a prisoner. He was still injured. He was still surrounded by enemies. But those enemies were now far more concerned with their own survival than with a single downed American pilot. A different German officer found him approximately 20 minutes later, after the initial shock had passed, and some semblance of order had been restored. This one was older, his uniform more worn, his expression more tired than angry. Look at Patterson with what might have been professional respect, or might have been simple exhaustion. The American was helped to his feet, searched more thoroughly this time, and led toward a building that had escaped damage. Along the way, Patterson counted what he could see. At least 7 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 2 flak positions out of action, multiple vehicles burning, several structures damaged. The airfield would not be launching fighters anytime soon. His captivity would last until the end of the war, spent in a prisoner of war camp where conditions deteriorated as the Reich collapsed. But that was months away and contained its own stories, its own survivals, its own quiet acts of endurance. What mattered in this moment was simpler. He had crashed on an enemy airfield. He had been captured, and his capture had, through the response it triggered, accomplished more damage than his original attack run could have achieved. The mathematics of it appealed to him, even as the guards led him away. The after-action reports told part of the story, but only part. The 357th Fighter Group's records credited the combined mission with destroying 9 enemy aircraft on the ground, damaging several others, and suppressing airfield operations for an estimated 3 days. Pilot debriefs mentioned the downed airmen, who'd been observed on the field, during the second attack wave, though none could confirm his status until Red Cross notifications began filtering through months later. What the reports couldn't capture was the ripple effect that spread outward from that frozen December airfield. The German response to the attack followed a pattern that American intelligence had been tracking for months. Surviving aircraft were dispersed to alternate fields, some of them improvised strips that had never been intended for sustained operations. Defensive gun positions were reinforced and repositioned, drawing resources away from other sectors. Communication networks were stressed by the need to coordinate the reconstitution of the damaged unit. None of this was decisive by itself. The Luftwaffe had been absorbing similar attacks across the Western Front for months, and would continue to absorb them until the final collapse. But each attack degraded overall capability. Each attack forced choices about resource allocation. Attack subtracted something from an enemy that had long since lost the ability to replace its losses. The specific German units that Patterson had encountered never fully recovered its operational status. Records captured after the war showed a progressive decline in sortie rates, aircraft availability, and pilot readiness that accelerated following the December attack. The unit was eventually consolidated with the remnants of 2 other squadrons itself, a sign of the attrition that was grinding down Luftwaffe's strength across all sectors. For the American fighter groups involved, the mission became an example. Cited in tactical discussions about coordinated airfield attacks, the speed with which the second wave had been assembled, the effectiveness of targeting already suppressed defenses, and the use of radio coordination to mass available aircraft all pointed toward doctrinal refinements that would be formally incorporated into training materials. Patterson's survival and capture also contributed to an evolving understanding of pilot recovery operations. His wingman's decision to circle and radio for assistance rather than simply mark the location and depart had triggered the response that ultimately devastated the airfield. This suggested that rapid reinforcement, when practical, could convert a defensive rescue posture into an offensive opportunity. The numbers were small in the context of the overall air war. A single pilot, a single airfield, a few dozen enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged across the various attacks that day. But the aggregate effect of thousands of such small engagements was anything but small. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded not because any single mission was decisive, but because the cumulative weight of daily operations eventually exceeded what the German military economy could sustain. Patterson spent the remaining months of the war in Stalaklü I, on the Baltic coast, near B. He arrived in January of 1945, his ankle still healing from the crash, his weight already declining from the limited rations available to prisoners. He found himself among hundreds of other American airmen, each with their own story of being shot down, captured, and transported to this windswept compound where the war could only be followed through rumors and distant sounds. The camp's liberation came in May when Soviet forces advancing from the east reached the facility. The Germans had already begun evacuating, and the prisoners found themselves in a strange limbo, technically free, but still waiting for transportation home. Patterson was eventually evacuated by air to France, then shipped back to the United States on a transport packed with returning PS. His debriefings covered the standard topics: evasion attempts, treatment in captivity, intelligence observations, what he could share about German military disposition based on his limited vantage point. The debriefers were thorough, but not particularly interested in the details of his shootdown. It was one story among thousands, distinguished only by the unusual circumstance of crashing directly onto an enemy airfield. Patterson returned to Ohio in the summer of 1945, to a family farm that had continued without him, and a civilian world that seemed both familiar and impossibly strange. He had left as a mechanic who could fly. He returned as a combat veteran with 38 missions, 2 confirmed kills, and a story that he rarely told. The years after the war were kind to Robert Patterson in ways that the war itself had not been. Used the GI Bill to complete an engineering degree, translating the intuitive mechanical understanding he'd developed on the farm and in the cockpit into formal credentials. He found work with an aircraft manufacturer, then moved to the aerospace industry as it expanded to meet Cold War demands. His career was distinguished without being famous. He contributed to projects that advanced American aviation, though his name rarely appeared in public documents. Colleagues remembered him as methodical, observant, and possessed of an almost uncanny ability to identify problems before they manifested as failures. He had learned that skill in combat, where the difference between identifying a warning sign and missing it could be measured in lives. He married, raised children, watched grandchildren arrive. He attended reunions of the 357th Fighter Group, growing fewer each. His aide claimed the men who had once flown together through the most dangerous skies in the world. He rarely spoke of his own experience in detail, preferring to listen as others told their stories, filling in the larger picture that his own memories could only sketch. The airfield, where he had crashed, remained a mystery for decades. American records documented its attack, but not its precise location, and the post-war redrawing of maps and jurisdictions complicated reconstruction. It wasn't until the 1980s, when a German aviation historian began corresponding with American veterans, that Patterson learned what had happened to the place where he had once expected to die. The airfield had been abandoned after the war, its facilities dismantled, its runways plowed under and returned to agricultural use. The only remaining evidence of its existence was a slight depression in the earth, where the main strip had been, visible from the air, but indistinguishable from countless other scars that the war had left on the European landscape. Patterson found this somehow appropriate. The war had been fought over control of airspace that had no permanent features, no monuments, no lasting marks. The contrails faded. The wreckage was salvaged or buried. The airfields returned to farmland. All that remained were the memories of those who had been there, and those memories were themselves impermanent. He was interviewed once, in 1992, by a researcher, compiling oral histories of the air war. The recording captured his voice, slower now with age, but still carrying the measured cadences of a man who thought before he spoke. He talked about training, about missions, about the cold and the fear and the peculiar camaraderie of men who flew together into danger. When the interviewer asked about the most memorable moment of his war, Patterson was quiet for a long time. Then he described the crash, the capture, the German officer standing over him, the sound of aircraft engines approaching. Save? That, in that moment, pressed against the frozen ground, with destruction raining down around him. He had understood something that took him years to articulate. He had understood that in war, the difference between victory and defeat often came down to seeing what others missed. Not courage, not skill, not even luck, just attention. Just the willingness to observe what was actually happening rather than what you expected to happen. The Germans had captured him, but they hadn't seen the circling aircraft. They hadn't calculated the response time for American reinforcements. They hadn't understood that their moment of triumph was actually a moment of vulnerability. They laughed because the situation was absurd, because he was about to die. And he knew something his captors didn't, because sometimes in the middle of chaos, the only rational response is to acknowledge how far beyond your control events have spiraled. Robert Patterson died in 2ED3 at 81 years of age. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, but not the specific details. He was buried in Ohio, not far from the farm where he had grown up, in a cemetery where other veterans of his generation had also come to rest. The lesson he left behind was not about heroism, though his actions certainly qualified. It was about perception, about the split second when understanding arrives and changes everything, about the 41 seconds between a laugh and a silence that marked the moment when one man's awareness became another man's defeat. In the end, the war in the air was won by men who paid attention, who noticed what others missed, who turned apparent disasters into unexpected victories, not through superhuman effort, but through the simple, difficult discipline of seeing clearly. The skies over Europe are quiet now. The contrails that once traced paths towards targets in the Reich have long since faded. The pilots who flew those missions are nearly all gone, their memories surviving only in archives and oral histories, and the occasional story told by grandchildren who never fully understood what their grandfathers had seen. But somewhere in those archives, in those stories, in those fading photographs of young men standing beside aircraft that would carry them into history, the truth persists. War is Charles. Survival is observation.